Thank you everyone for coming. Last week we had a smaller turnout because it was in the middle of the mid-semester break. So some of you may have missed it. You guys didn't. You guys, thank you for coming. But we covered ancient Greece and Socrates, and today we'll be covering Plato. So Plato, as you may know, was a student to Socrates and was himself later a teacher to Aristotle. And I think it's really important to understand Plato. No philosophy course would be complete without it. I think studying philosophy without understanding Plato would be like studying chemistry without knowing the periodic table, because there's a quote you'll see on the next slide: everything is a footnote to Plato. So the idea is any idea that you've read and think is original and interesting probably has some basis in Plato or in response to Plato. Obviously it's an exaggeration, but there is a grain of truth to the idea that Plato kind of articulated all the basic questions in philosophy. I don't think he posited the right answers, but he was very important in that whole process. So you may want to take notes if you want to really seriously absorb this information, because there's a lot of information. Alternatively, if you just prefer to listen and just enjoy it, that's fine as well. Okay, good. Is everyone ready to go? Okay, good. We've also got a group activity later on, and we've got a video where there's an analysis of the piece of art that painting is from. That's actually a tiny piece of a much bigger painting. Okay. Great. So here's some basic biographical details of Plato. I'll just let you kind of read that. So look, to be honest, I just asked ChatGPT, give me 5 points on the biography of Plato, and it did an all right job. So that's kind of right. The rest, I assure you, is written by me, except for one other slide, but I disclaim it there. Well, you know, there you go. So like most philosophers then, he had the luxury of not actually being required to do any work. And of course, I do consider philosophy work, but let's say material, practical work. So he was born into a relatively affluent aristocratic family. And this sentencing to death of Socrates, which we covered last week for those in attendance, was a very traumatic experience for Plato. Plato was, I think, 27 or 29, late 20s, when Socrates, his teacher, was killed by a democratic vote during his trial. And he writes his early dialogues in response to this. Just move on. There's so much I want to say, but I think it's better if we wait till the later slides. And again, why understand Plato? So this is just to motivate you, give you an idea of what the benefit of this is. He's probably the most influential philosopher in Western history. Why? Because he articulated a closed system, by which I mean everything has a base. Ultimately, if you reduce it back enough steps, has a base in metaphysics. So his political conclusions, his ethical conclusions, so his political conclusions depend on his ethical conclusions. His ethical conclusions depend on his epistemological conclusions. And his epistemology depends on his metaphysics. And just a reminder for those who don't remember, I know you all know what ethics and politics is. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we acquire knowledge, how we can be certain of anything. Can we be certain? These kinds of questions are all epistemology. And then metaphysics is the nature and the study of what is. So when I say a philosophical system was developed by Plato, I mean that he actually went like this. He said, this is what the world is like. This is how we know it. This is what we ought to do. This is how we ought to live, politically speaking. And this is, he also had another branch of aesthetics. And that's how you know you have a philosophical system. It's not just random disconnected thoughts. He actually, in the same way that, you know, a constitution articulates a system of government, Plato was effectively the constitution writer for the first philosophical system. Now, he wrote 35 dialogues and other texts as well, and he was a very prolific writer. Now, these Socratic dialogues, we'll go into more detail later, but these are actually the dialogues through which most of our information on Socrates comes. There were other writers like Xenophon, but Plato was definitely the most major figure. And there are even some theories. Bertrand Russell, a major philosopher, was a proponent of the idea that it's possible that Socrates was actually made up completely by Plato, that he was never actually a person who lived. I don't think it's likely, and I don't think even Bertrand Russell thinks it's likely, but it's possible. So most likely, Socrates was indeed a real person, and Plato definitely was. But we do know that Plato's dialogues early on, so he started writing the Socratic dialogues after Socrates' death, and we know that the early dialogues are more or less faithful to the true character of Socrates. They actually reflect what he was like, and Socrates only advances in those dialogues the kinds of views that Socrates really would advance, so the character of Socrates does. But as we move along in Plato, you'll see that he starts putting his own views into the character of Socrates, and many positions that are articulated in the later dialogues have no connection to the real original Socrates. It's really just, he's effectively a mouthpiece for what Plato was himself trying to convince his audience of. And, you know, it's interesting. It's very mixed, Plato, because on the other hand, he was this universal genius, definitely. If anyone was, it was probably him. And on the other hand, he was the father of all these things like mysticism, religion, and totalitarianism. He articulated the very first sort of totalitarian system of government. Of course, the word was not around back then, but looking at it now, we can see the state controls everything in Plato's Republic, which we'll discuss later today. So that's why you should understand Plato. Everything is really a footnote to him. That's a quote. I don't believe that necessarily. But everything either agrees or responds to Plato in some direct or indirect manner. And you can't understand philosophy after Plato without understanding Plato first. Okay, so hopefully now you all have some incentive to listen, I guess. So let's start with his Metaphysics and Epistemology. So again, this is the study of what is and how we know it. So before Plato, there was a huge split between Heraclitean flux. Remember Heraclitus? He claimed that the only constant is change, that we can't, we don't really assert the existence of any permanent entities. Everything is always undergoing a process of change, and all we have is really change to work with. And this posed a problem for logic, because logic requires that whatever you're reasoning about persist for at least some time while you make a proposition about it. And so, again, that one person, what was his name? Crowdless, took that so seriously that he actually stopped speaking on principle because he didn't want to talk about something that didn't exist. And you know, the moment you posited it, it's gone, according to Heraclitus. So that was the one hand. On the other hand, you have Pythagorean mysticism, which is more closely aligned with Plato. But in effect, he's saying, you know, we're going to, this world is an illusion. The truth, the permanent, unchanging truth, is something higher. And there was just this disconnect between the two. There was also a third group called the materialists, with which Aristotle demolished their philosophy, but Plato came before Aristotle. And Plato also didn't like the materialists. He thought they weren't really philosophizing. Materialism, in the metaphysical sense, doesn't mean what we say materialism is today. It doesn't mean liking, you know, fast cars and whatever. It means believing that a thing consists, but the thing that gives a particular entity substance is the material that makes it up. So substance is the study of what is the persistent thing within an entity. Well, if you're a bit confused by this, don't worry, because we will cover it next week on Aristotle. So Plato tries to fix this chasm that was created in metaphysics. And how does he do this? He posits two separate realities. Now, you'll see Kant does a very different version of this, but he also separates reality into two pieces, the phenomenal and the noumenal. Plato does this by distinguishing the world of particulars, which is the world that we perceive with our senses, from the world of forms, which is the abstract world, the perfect, unchanging world, which we can only reach through a process of, let's say, intellectual enlightenment. So let's look at the differences between these two worlds that Plato posits. Those are the main differences. So the world of particulars is made up of actual material. There's matter involved. World of forms doesn't have that matter. The world of particulars, the particulars doesn't mean they're infinite, but they are unlimited hypothetically. You can have another person, and then that's another particular. You can have another piece of grass, that's another particular. But how many forms of a person are there? One. How many forms of grass are there? One. So singular versus unlimited, that's another distinction. These are in effect the four arguments that Plato gives for distinguishing particulars and forms. The particulars are changing and imperfect. Everything is flux, as Heraclitus said, and Plato said, well enough, it might be in the world of particulars. In the world of particulars, everything is always changing. Entities don't persist. Oh, thank you very much. And lastly, the world of particulars is accessible to us through our senses, whereas the world of forms is accessible only by the intellect. And you'll see in ethics, not everybody has the same ability, according to Plato, to reach this world of forms. And he makes a number of conclusions from that. So I've attached a quote here from the Republic, which is Plato's most famous text. What shall we say about those spectators? So there's this deliberative quality to these dialogues because it's as if Socrates is always asking a question. What shall we say about those spectators then who can see a plurality of beautiful things, but not beauty itself? So he says, when you see the plurality of beautiful things, that is in the world of particulars. When you see beauty itself, that's in the world of forms. But you can't see it. You can't see the concept of beauty. You can only see some specific beautiful thing. And who are incapable of following if someone else tries to lead them to it, right? You can't try to explain the form of the beautiful to somebody. How would you even do that? Since you can't appeal to anything from this world, from sense experience. You can only say, there's some quality within this specific thing that I find beautiful that makes it beautiful. But that's pretty much as far as you can go. And he gives another example. Moral actions. You can find instances of moral actions, you can see them, but you can't see morality. They only ever entertain beliefs and do not know any of the things they believe. There's a question. So that's kind of how he posits this. Now you might be wondering already, what's the point of this world of forms? Why is he positing this? Plato says, well, we actually already have it within us, this knowledge that there is such a thing as morality, or that there is such a thing as beauty. We don't necessarily know what it is, and we can't point to it itself, but it's in our heads somehow. So how did it get there? Because after all, if we can't perceive beauty itself, and we can't perceive morality itself, then if all our knowledge comes from our perception, well, it would be impossible, right? If all our knowledge comes from perception, and we cannot perceive a concept, how do we arrive at a concept? How do we develop such an idea as beauty or a form of any kind? Does everyone understand that? Yes? All right, again, this is that slide I said I couldn't be bothered writing out myself. But you'll see actually it's basically a copy. They just replaced justice and beauty. Abstract perfect concept exists independently of human perception. It is the standard of what is justified or beautiful. And all instances, this is really important, all instances in the world of particulars, that is, of this thing are of the form of justice or the form of beauty or whatever form you like. It can really be the form of anything. It can be the form of tableness, right? The form of tableness, according to Plato, is inherent in every table, in every particular table. And there's an unlimited not unlimited. Yeah, there's an unlimited, hypothetically, number of tables, but there's only one form of tableness, right? It's just an example. And all these projections in the physical world, the world of particulars, are just these imperfect replications of this. And that's why they all look different. That's why all the beautiful things are different. And that's why all instances of justice are different instances. And that's why all tables are a little bit different, is because they all are imperfect copies of this form. And so if there's only one form of perfection, but there's an infinite version of imperfections, right? So there's, according to Plato, only one way to make something perfect, but there's an infinite number of ways to make something imperfect. That's why they all differ. Okay, great. So what's required epistemically is a knowledge of these forms so that you can identify them and work with them. So that creates a question: how do we get this knowledge? Well, sense perception is out because it only gives us knowledge of the world of particulars. It can't penetrate down to what the form is, yes? Sometimes we look at things that have quite a lot of forms within them. For example, this wooden table has the form of tableness, according to Plato. It has the form of woodness, right? It has the form of three-leggedness, and so on. But how do we know, how do we identify all these forms? Now, now you might be thinking, well, I form a concept by looking at specific things in the world and omitting the differences between them and recognizing only the basic similarities. So, for example, you look at all people, you notice everyone's a little bit different. You can distinguish people if you need to, but you also have no problem holding the concept of person in your head. And this concept, which Plato would call form, even though he thinks the form actually exists, it doesn't exist just in your head. You're just aware of it. It doesn't mean that it exists in your head. It exists in a world of forms, and you're just aware of this. He rejects the idea that this is formed by looking at lots of instances of something and then just omitting the differences and looking at only the similarities. That's called enumerating instances, right? Now, how does he do this? Why does he hold this view? He says, okay, imagine I asked you to find a new concept. We're going to call it blah, okay? Blah is an actual thing. It's a concept. It's like beauty or justice or something. It's the form of blah. Now, I would like you to identify in this room what the blahs are. And you would say, well, how would I do that? And I'd say it's very easy. To understand the form of the blah, you just have to identify all the blahs and then see what they all have in common. Yeah? Now, Plato says this is impossible if you don't already know what to look for. You have to know in advance what a blah consists of, and then you can figure it out. So if I say to you, you have to identify all the, let's say I bring in, I don't know, a person who's never seen other people, right? But somehow they can speak English. And then I say, identify all the people in this room. And he says, what's a person? I say, well, it's you know, they move, they have two arms, two legs, generally, they all have a head, and they look kind of like you, right? And you'll be like, okay, well, these are all people. But you can't have it the other way around according to Plato. So he says there's nothing that would allow you to develop a concept in the world of particulars if you didn't already have the concept to begin with, and then you identify that form in the particulars you look at in a sort of imperfect way. Now, he gives other arguments, like you've never seen a straight line, and yet you know the mathematical properties of a straight line. It's an extension in one dimension. If I drew a straight line, that would not, firstly, it wouldn't be straight, wouldn't be quite perfect. Even if I used a ruler, it still wouldn't be perfect. Also, it would actually be two-dimensional because it would have a certain width. And it would be three-dimensional because the ink I would draw would have a little depth to it as well. So what you think is a single-dimensional, what's it called, extension, would be, in fact, a three-dimensional object. And yet you have no problem understanding what a straight line is without ever seeing one. So Plato, I'm giving the best account of what Plato is trying to argue here. So I'm trying to make his argument as strong as possible. Don't confuse it with my views. But that's what he says, that you have to have the knowledge of forms already in advance. Now, so that's the second last point there. It's not acquired by means of deduction from sense experience. And if that's the case, where does it come from? Now, Plato says something which lays the basis for all mysticism, and we'll see what that is in a second. Now, I think the best way to do this is with an example. There is a dialogue, a Socratic dialogue, called the Meno dialogue. And in the Meno, Meno is the name of the person that Socrates is speaking with in the dialogue. But of course, it's Plato writing the whole thing. In the Meno, we start with a question of whether virtue can be taught. But there's a certain point where Socrates argues that we have innate concepts, what we now call innate concepts. It means ideas or knowledge of the forms, as Plato puts it, that we have coming into the world, and that enables us to identify, if you go back to my example, the blahs when we see them, you know, or the straight lines when we see them or something like that. Now, what Socrates does is he says, look, I will prove to you, Meno, that we have innate concepts by getting your slave, this slave boy who's completely uneducated, to prove that he has an understanding within him of geometry. So he gives Meno's slave a geometric formula, and he says, okay, let's take a square, that first square there, the yellow one, there it's appearing now, that has a dimension of 1 by 1, yeah? And then he asks the slave to identify this, and the slave says, okay, yes, it has 1 by 1 dimensions. And he says, okay, now we multiply the side by the side to get the area. And so that's got an area of 1. And then he says, okay, now tell me what would have to be the side length of a square for that square to have double the area of that initial yellow square there. Yep. So now, of course, you guys all know Pythagoras' theorem. So it's actually the square root of 2, because it's 1, you know, a squared plus b squared over c squared, sorry, equals c squared. So he gets him to develop this complex geometric formula. Now, the point that he's trying to prove is that we come into the world with these innate concepts and we're able to apply them, but we need to be reminded. We need to have this kind of teaching going on. And asking questions is perfectly sufficient, according to Socrates, to jog someone's memory, in effect, and have them recall the forms that they came into the world with. So if you see the second point there, I say Socrates claims to be teaching nothing, and the slave is just recollecting existing knowledge of forms. Now, this Meno dialogue has been criticized widely, because the kind of argument is that Socrates was actually feeding him information the whole time, that he wasn't being genuine in saying, I'm not teaching anything. So it was sort of to the effect that, well, don't you see that by drawing a diagonal line, we can get the hypotenuse, and that would have double the area. But in any case, that's what Plato used as one example to demonstrate why we have innate concepts. Now, okay, the next question is, where do these innate concepts come from? If they don't come from the world of particulars, where do they, and we're born with them, right? Well, yes. It's inherent in our subconscious, or the ancient equivalent of that, since birth. And this requires, of course, a separation between the soul, which has an innate knowledge of all the forms, and the body, which is here, material, ephemeral, gonna die, in the world of particulars. So this soul leaves this is again Platonic mysticism, it leaves the body of the person who died, enters a new body. Now, if this were the case, then logically, wouldn't that soul have all its memories and all of that when it entered the baby? Wouldn't it have the knowledge of all the previous lives it had lived? No, Plato has an explanation for that too. He says it experiences, in effect, a birth trauma, what Freud would call a birth trauma, where it forgets all these forms, except it doesn't really forget them, it just suppresses them, and then it has to be reminded throughout its life. So the argument here goes that nothing is really new knowledge to us. Everything we learn is actually just a recollection of some knowledge of forms that we gained in a prior life. So whenever we claim to be discovering a form, we are in fact merely recollecting that knowledge which is already within us. Now, does this mean that the world of particulars is something we should reject altogether? Plato says, well, ultimately, yes, but not straight away. It's not the case that being, for instance, having no sense perception would benefit you as a philosopher, because especially early on in our lives, we require perception of the world of particulars to jog our memory and remind us of the forms. So, for example, you see lots of dogs, and you go, yes, the form of the dog, it comes back to me. So what he's trying to do is integrating sense perception and our faculty of understanding. What he says is because of our body and because of the crudeness of our senses and all that, we can only get knowledge of the world of particulars directly, and the knowledge of the world of forms is inherent within us. And when we're exposed to these particulars, we identify the forms within them, and then we make that knowledge explicit by going, that's the form of, table or justice or beauty. Now, this is you see the last point. It says raises an important question: why isn't the soul perfect? What's the soul even like? And why aren't people with souls perfect? Because after all, that soul belongs to the world of forms, which is perfect. Now we get on to Plato's ethics. As I mentioned, the mind and the body are divided. Not the mind, the soul and the body are divided. So to address this, I already talked about the trauma that the soul experiences in moving over into a new individual. It also inclines the soul. Right. So what he does is he divides the soul into three parts. Plato says, why isn't everybody just seeking enlightenment then? If we have this knowledge of forms within us, and the highest form is the form of the good is that at which all things are aimed, he says, then why do we feel this pursuit of lesser functions? Why are we appetitive and competitive and all of this? Well, he claims each soul has three components, and each individual's innate disposition determines the level of potential it has. This is inherent but not genetic, since the soul is separate from the body. So, of course, if the soul were the same thing as the body, then it would be genetic. But he says, no, the soul is separate from the body. So even if you had two Philosopher-Kings, which is like the highest form of individual, as parents, then it's no guarantee that you will be a Philosopher-King, and vice versa. So what are these three parts? He really just compares them to metals. Gold is the rational mind. Silver is strength or will. And iron, cast iron or bronze sometimes, is appetites. So the rational mind, you all understand what that is. Strength and will, that impels action, because even if nobody's fully one of these, if you were fully gold in your soul, you would do nothing. You would just sit there and be rational. And if you were fully strength and will, you would have all this energy and nothing to do with it. And if you were fully appetitive, then you would live like an animal, right? Just pursuing instincts. So he says that everybody is inclined toward one of these, and the one that you're inclined to determines, in effect, what kind of life you will lead. And of course, the most common being iron, according to Plato. This is the majority of people, and they pursue appetites primarily, and their rational mind is enslaved to their appetites, meaning whatever their appetites tell them to do, their emotions, whatever, their mind will try to figure out ways to get that, and it will employ strength and will when necessary, when action is necessary, but it will have a very loose hold of this. Conversely, you have people who are primarily, let's say, silver-souled, according to Plato, who are very determined, but their determination requires some kind of direction, and they provide minimal direction for themselves. So these are people who just go from achievement to achievement to achievement because they're addicted to achieving without any end goal. They just like the sense of achievement. So often they're also pursuing appetites, but not for the sake of the appetites, but rather for the sake of the pursuit. And then you have gold, and of course Plato considered himself gold-souled, and philosophers gold-souled, because they are directed by reason, and they subordinate their will to take action when it's necessary, and only when their rational mind impels them to use it. Whereas the appetites are kind of put in their place. He also compares these to animals. He says that the appetites is like a multi-headed beast. It's so powerful. Silver is like a lion. It's powerful, but still much smaller than this beast. And the rational mind is like a little person. So that's kind of how he explains why most people are not inclined toward enlightenment. So weakness, according to Plato, consists of allowing the appetitive aspect of the soul to rule over the mental. So you can see where his totalitarianism comes from when we get to that. Now, I mentioned in our very first lesson the allegory of the cave. For those who weren't here, I'll quickly go through it again. So I've got the diagram here, and you can see who are you? You are the, see that wall in the middle? You are the prisoners on the left of that wall, sitting down, watching the shadows on the wall. Now, you've been there your whole life, and you think that's what reality is, because after all, you have no other knowledge. So it would stand to reason, it would be quite rational for you to believe that's it. That's all that's what reality consists of. You have no other awareness. But Plato says, imagine that one of these prisoners is released. Now he is taken, and he sees these priests, or whoever they are, holding these signs which project the shadows. And he says, oh my God, so these are just shadows. The real thing is these signs. And then the people who released the prisoner say, oh, you haven't seen anything yet. And then they take him out of the cave, and there he is standing up, sees the world, and he's just amazed. Now, at this point, not only is he amazed, he's also blinded by the sun. And when he goes, he has a choice. He can just run away, or he can go back and try to enlighten the people he grew up with. So he says, all right, I want to bring all my friends out here. So he goes back, and this is a quote. He returns to the cave to try to convince them. I'll read it, so you don't have to if you prefer. If he went back underground and sat down again in the same spot, would the sudden transition from the sunlight mean that his eyes would be overwhelmed by darkness? Certainly. Now the process of adjustment would be quite long this time, so adjusting to the darkness. And suppose that before his eyes had settled down and while he wasn't seeing well, he had once again to compete against those same old prisoners and identifying those shadows. Why does this have a significance? Because given these people still in the cave think that the shadows are all of reality, they will assess a person's sanity based on their ability to identify the shadows, won't they? So when this person comes back from outside, back into the cave, and he looks at the shadows, he won't even be able to recognize them because he's just been blinded by the incredible reality of sunlight. So he would be like, who cares if I can't identify them? You guys have got to follow me and see the real world. Would he make a fool of himself? Wouldn't they say that he'd come back from his upward journey with his eyes ruined, and that it wasn't even worth trying to go up there? And would they, if they could, grab hold of anyone who tried to set them free and take them up there and kill him? So this is Plato's explanation of why most people are not interested in enlightenment, in understanding the forms, and are content to pursue appetites. This is a meme I found, which is just, the 2023 version of exactly the same thing, and I thought it was quite funny. Yeah, literally just outside. Guy who logs off. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so moving on to, we've gone through metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, going on to politics. The most popular account of his politics is found in the Republic, which I mentioned. And in the Republic, it's a largish book, given Plato's dialogues, and even though it's not that, that big. Socrates is found conversing with quite a number of people. Here are a few examples: Glaucon, Thrasymachus, Polemarchus, Cephalus, and Adimantus. The central topics of discussion include justice, politics, ethics, statesmanship, the ideal state, the ideal ruler, who should rule, who should obey. Now, what's the key idea? There's a lot of really key ideas, so it's hard to even say what the book is about, but most people agree it's about politics and the organization of the ideal state. But in the Republic, you find references to everything, including perception, metaphysics, and religion, and so on. But the basic idea is that the individual state is the state in which each person is subordinated to universal principles of justice and virtue. And the same principles apply to the administration of the state, which apply to the administration of the individual for themselves. So just as we have these three parts of our soul, and Plato says that the gold should take the lead, and silver should be subordinated to the will of the gold, and appetites should be kept to a minimum, and done only what they do best, which is provide material sustenance so that the body can survive, only so that that body and soul can go on to understand the forms, and no more. So there's no interest in wealth creation beyond pure necessities. So it's kind of a socialist dictatorship, but it's more complicated than that. Now the rulers are philosopher-kings, whose souls are predisposed toward the gold. The auxiliaries or guardians defend the state, and they're driven by strength and discipline. And they should be raised, according to Plato, in absolutely Spartan conditions. They should never know their parents. They should never know who their siblings are, and so on. Their only loyalty should be to the philosopher-kings. And everybody else will just be a craftsman, artist, tradesperson, whatever. And this is, these are people Plato had effectively contempt for. He wasn't interested in non-philosophers or guardians. And he, in fact, advocated the use of propaganda and lies to keep the population under the control of the philosopher-kings. Does this sound familiar? Given 20th century history. The citizens of the state seek to protect their fellow citizens and feel intense animosity towards rival states. This is another feature of all dictatorships, which is they require war. Not only do they like war, not only do they start wars, they actually require war for several reasons. One is they run out of internal victims to subjugate, and they require constant expansion to steal effectively more wealth to keep themselves afloat. Or they require being funded from the outside. But the other thing is psychological. The citizens of the state need to feel that there's an enemy, and this would require, this would mean that they wouldn't be too concerned with personal privations. They wouldn't be focusing their energy against their own rulers. They'd be focusing on defeating the opposing army. It's really interesting just how philosophically accurate this is in terms of its description of dictatorships of all kinds. So children are tested at a young age. This reads like a Hunger Games or something like that novel, and they're examined by a board of philosophers. The philosophers understand the forms, and therefore they'll be able to look into the child's soul and say, oh, right, I see, you're a dirty craftsman, right? Or you're an elite philosopher-king, we're going to look after you. And as I said, these auxiliaries are trained to defend the state, and they're trained in the art of war. Socrates, not Socrates himself, the character of Socrates in the Republic advocates taking guardian children to observe battles, to desensitize them to witnessing death and pain. There's more weird stuff on rewards and stuff that they would get, but I haven't included that. You can look into it yourself. Okay, so let's move on to education in his ideal state. Yeah, so again, we have that idea that education is recollection. It's not any new information. It's merely saying, so you see, this is the form, and the child goes, oh yes, that's the form. Our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light He's referencing the cave. Just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body, so too the instrument of knowledge can only be the movement of the whole soul, be turned from the world of becoming into that of being. Now, what does he mean by the world of becoming and the world of being? The world of being is the world of forms, the real world, the unchanging, imperfect world. The world of becoming is this world of particulars where everything is changing. So by becoming, he means changing. And they must endure the sight of being, meaning be able to withstand the sheer awe of understanding the forms and the brightest and the best of being, in other words, of the good. So once you've reached this stage of enlightenment, you understand the forms all at once. It comes to you like a mystic revelation, comes to you exactly like a mystic revelation, and you understand the form of the good, which is the highest form. And that's why Plato says the good is that at which all things are aimed, because everything is reducible down to forms or is infused with forms. These forms have also a kind of hierarchy, and at the very top of this hierarchy is the form of the good, which means that there is some kind of teleology, some goal-directed point to some point to which everything is working. By the way, you might ask, well, what is this? What is it like to experience this? And Plato gives up. He says, I can't tell you, because to those who understand, no explanation is necessary. To those who do not, no explanation is possible. So he doesn't tell us. It's very inconvenient. All right, so we've covered politics. Now, interestingly, Plato despised aesthetics. He thought the only aesthetics that should exist are those that effectively serve the philosophic interests of his perfect state. And he fully acknowledged the significance of art in human life. But he thought that the arts, I'll read from here, they're representations of representations, because the world of particulars is just is an imperfect, ephemeral, constantly changing, chaotic realm in which the forms are imperfectly projected. And so that means it's just kind of this representation of a form. And most people, according to Plato, aren't interested in the form itself. They're only interested in the representation. And art is a representation of that representation. So it's doubly perverted. He says it's even worse than just the world of particulars, because it's extolling particulars. It's saying this is something beautiful, when in fact it's really just, again, a representation of the particulars. So again, the Republic endorses absolute state control over all forms of art, including poetry and song. Now, it's interesting, actually. All dictatorships understand this in a way that democracies don't. They understand that you can't have free art if you want to control the population. So the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, whatever dictatorship you take as an example, regulate the hell out of art. They don't want anything they don't approve. And being a free artist is one of the greatest crimes you can commit, because you're effectively inspiring people in a direction that, in a way that political change just can't do. Political protests or anything like that don't compare to the kind of art that really goes into someone's soul and inspires them to change. So, but Plato understood this perfectly well. He says it's a danger to the state to allow innovation in music in this case. When modes of music change, the fundamental laws of the state always change with them. Okay. Heavy content. Now, where does this leave us? Is it possible we'll ever have a Platonic republic? Or indeed, there's always this struggle to subordinate politics to philosophical principles. And politicians are often very unphilosophical. Sometimes there are exceptions, like this person here is Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, who was a Stoic. So not exactly an advocate of Plato, but he was an advocate of his philosophy of Stoicism, not originated by him, but he was a follower of it. And he resisted all the typical temptations that, Roman emperors would go for, the appetitive things. And he sought wisdom and virtue and all of this. but he's an exception, and his son was a disaster. Quote, "The society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of states, or indeed, my dear Glaucon, of humanity itself." And this is a very famous quote coming up. "Until philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers. And political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands." That's why Plato advocated rule by philosophers, Philosopher-Kings. Okay, we're going to do questions. I'm going to take a brief break. Yes.
Didn't really understand. So does Plato think that everyone is simply sharing one form of a soul?
That's a good question. No, there are different souls, right? Your soul is different to mine, according to Plato. What the soul has is a knowledge of the forms. It's not. I'm not sure if this is a good question. I actually wondered about this myself. I'm not sure if he meant that the soul is itself a form, because that would be contradictory, right? If you can't have multiple forms of the same kind of thing, right? It's one triangularity, one justice, one whatever. So I think the soul is a particular, but it has the knowledge. It's the only kind of particular that has a knowledge of the forms, because it's not, in effect, ruined and made imperfect by having physical reality, because the soul isn't physical. Yeah, that's my interpretation, but yeah.
So, was his understanding then is so that all the tables have the form of the table?
Yep.
I mean, in the realm of forms, they're somehow taking something from that realm. So essentially, are all human beings somehow connected because of the world of forms?
Well, all human beings are imperfect projections of the form of the human being. Yeah. So we all contain the form of the person or the human being, whatever you want to call it. But we're all different because we're in the world of particulars. So we're each particular instances. Is that what you mean? Was there another layer to that question?
I'm wondering if you it back. So essentially, are we all the same in this thinking?
No.
Because we're particulars, I get that.
Yep.
But is he arguing that?
All particulars have. So a particular doesn't just have one form. It's not, let's say, infused with only one form.
Yeah.
For example, you have the form, according to Plato, of blue-eyedness, right? I have the form of brown-eyedness, right? So we don't share that form. We do share the form of being a person, right? Or the form of the person. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Joseph?
Yes,
yeah.
Question about, you see that when you're born, your soul experiences like the trauma of birth, therefore losing all its knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a finite amount of knowledge that the soul can hold. Like the soul always got a finite amount of not just existing in the world of perfect world of the universe. That's it.
I think so. I think yes, because there must be limited forms, right? Why would there be unlimited forms? But you can, I mean, there would be a great number of forms, enormous number, but yes, there is a limited knowledge, I think, according to Plato, in each soul, and it just suppresses this knowledge when it moves to another body, right? Or I don't know if he advocated some kind of reincarnation, or if he was saying that the soul comes from not a dead person, but somewhere else, or But yes, definitely believed this. The soul is separate from the body. It inhabits the body during the life, and then it leaves. Yeah, and that's the thing. He also said you can harm your soul without harming your body, right? So corruption is the corruption of the soul, and he agrees with this on the real Socrates. Not the character, the real Socrates himself said that the only great harm we can suffer is harm to the soul, when we harm our own soul. And the soul can only be corrupted by that soul's body, or by that soul itself and its choices. So to suffer injustice is nothing compared to committing injustice, according to both Socrates and Plato. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Just touching on like the whole reincarnation. I was thinking about it, like if the soul's born, does that mean that it's coming from a particular place, or is like rebirth where someone has died and their soul is now passed on to the wrong form? Then when a new person gets born,
yeah, I don't think it matters. I don't know. And it doesn't really make a difference whether the soul goes up for a while into the world of forms and then comes back or what, like point is that it's separate and it leaves upon death and it comes in upon birth or a little bit before birth or whatever. Yeah.
Like we do like population demands, like if you would have a growing population, does that mean that new souls then have to be formed?
Can souls be created? I think he does say something on that, but I actually don't know what he says about that, about the creation of the soul. Yeah. Actually, I didn't mention, and I only thought of this earlier today when I was walking here, I didn't mention how Plato explains the creation of the universe. And he explains it like this. I'll be very quick about this explanation. There was before we had any kind of order in the universe, there was just chaos. Matter was sort of floating around chaotically. And there was a demiurge, a kind of consciousness, sort of like a god, but nothing like the Christian God. This God didn't have any ethical interests or anything. He just sort of came along and he thought, okay, this is chaos. This God had knowledge of the world of forms, because remember, the world of forms is uncreated and eternal. So the forms have always existed. He said, okay, I want, the forms are perfect. I want to make this perfect. So he decided, okay, I'm going to project the world of forms onto this world of particulars. And he did this, but why couldn't he do this perfectly? Why couldn't he just create a perfect copy? Because there was this recalcitrant element in this world of particulars, and that element was empty space. And this empty space had this kind of quality, according to Plato, of distorting the forms as they tried to be implemented into the particulars. I know it's absolutely, like, don't ask me to justify it, it's ridiculous, yeah. But that's what created the world of particulars, according to Plato. That god was called the demiurge. Yeah. Okay. Any questions here? No? Yes?
So when Plato talks about transcending all the forms, does he believe he's going there when he
No.
dies?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Philosophy is about practicing the profession of dying, according to Plato. So whether it's again, there's no clear connection. Like, I don't think it makes any sense that the soul, which is a particular, can then ascend to the world of forms, which is a different world. Oh, well, to those who don't understand, no explanation is possible. Sorry. Yeah. I stand by my previous assertion on that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any online questions? Last week we did analysis of a poem and we got great feedback for that. So you guys also did a really good job, for those of you who were here last week, on analyzing the poem and explaining its philosophic significance. So I'm giving you a harder poem this week. So take a photo of this, because we're going to move on to another slide in a second, just so you know the questions. So I'm about to show you a poem, and you guys will go into 3 tables, I think. So you guys stay there, Joseph, you join here, and you guys talk among each other. And I'd like you to answer those 3 questions. So how does the following poem compare to Plato's account of moral virtue and what it consists of? B, how knowledge is acquired. And C, the connection between abstract knowledge and the world of particulars. Okay, so kind of a difficult assessment, but we'll see how you guys go. All right, so this is the poem. Yeah. Who would like me to read it so you guys get the intonation? Hands up. Hands up. Yeah. Hands up high. I can't see. All right. Yeah. Okay. That's like just over. Sorry. You guys can block your ears if you want. I'm going to read it. All right. Up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this toil and trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening lustre mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife. Come hear the woodland linnet, how sweet his music on my life. There's more of wisdom in it. And hark how blithe the throstle sings, he too is no mean preacher. I think he's talking about a bird there. Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless, spontaneous wisdom, breath breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. Sweet is the law which nature brings, our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things, we murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art, close up those barren leaves, come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. So that's, I think it's a 18th or maybe 19th century poet, William Wordsworth. The table's turned. So compare and contrast what this poem conveys on the sort of perceptual level. He's describing nature and describing books and all of that. Compare that to Plato's account of epistemology using these three questions. Okay. All right, so we'll do that for 5 minutes. You said something about experience and how we get the knowledge through experience, and empiricism was the word you used. Very good. So I don't think William Wordsworth is a Platonist. He's in fact quite the opposite. So William Wordsworth is saying to effectively a philosopher, you could say, or any intellectual, he's just telling this person, stop looking down at your books to try to acquire information, go look out into the world, interact with it, and you'll understand, you know, there's more wisdom in this little bird and his song than there is in your books in their Dullin and their Strife, right? There's that third last paragraph. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. A sage is a very wise person. So he's saying we must acquire knowledge of virtue and whatever else we want to acquire knowledge of empirically. I don't think he would agree with the even existence of such things as forms outside of particulars. But he's basically saying open your eyes and open up your heart to experience and emotion and all of this. And that's where you're going to get wisdom. You're not going to get wisdom by staring down a book. And specifically just trying to be, well, I won't say rational because that has a positive connotation, but rationalistic. Rationalistic is where you just, it's like a misappropriation of reason in the same way that being moralistic is a misappropriation of morality, right? Okay. Any points on this? Did you guys find this an interesting poem to work with? Yeah? Anyone not so much? Yeah? Okay, all right. Now, I'd like to, before we wrap up, show you a video. Remember that painting I showed at the start of Plato? There he is in the middle on the left. And who knows who's next to him on the right, in the middle on the right?
Wait, see the red?
Yeah, Plato, the one in the red pointing up with his right hand. Yes, it's Aristotle on the left. Very good. Now, Aristotle is a middle-aged man and Plato is an old man there. And that's pretty representative of their age difference because Plato was a teacher to Aristotle for 20 years at the academy. And this painting was made by Raphael in, I think, the Renaissance period. I forgot exactly where it's painted, but it's not a painting. It's actually on a wall. It's a painting on a wall. It's not on canvas, and it's very large. It's like a whole wall. You can see in the left corner there's a door, bottom left corner. That's actually a real door. Now this painting is called The School of Athens. You see Plato is pointing up with his right hand. They're facing each other, Plato and Aristotle in the middle. Plato is pointing up because that's where the world of forms is, right? Aristotle is and actually the people on sort of lining his flank, so on Plato's right side, you notice they have their heads bowed down. That's because they effectively, you could say they worship Plato's interpretation of the forms, but they think that they're effectively mystics. Whereas Aristotle, on the other side, he's not pointing up, he's pointing forward. He's doing this with his arm to represent the idea that, no, you have to look here, look down here, look, there's nothing, there is no world of forms. And we'll get to Aristotle next week. You also see Socrates. Socrates is on Plato's side, about 4 people down from Plato. He's the one facing away from them, and he's talking to a few people, the one in the gray there. And you can see the people seem quite disinterested and annoyed, which is quite characteristic of interlocutors with Socrates. And you've got other famous figures, but basically this is a painting of all the great philosophers up to that time, especially the ancient philosophers. So we're going to wrap up for today. Next week, we'll be doing Aristotle, and I'm really excited. I've already got the slides ready. Father of logic, sciences, objectivity. I really admire Aristotle. Of course, he wasn't right about many, many things, but definitely worth coming to that one if you're just going to come to one more course or something like that. Okay, you can register there. Thank you all very much.